Welcome to Fix My Hog. As we all know, I'm Bob LaRosa. I want to welcome you to another nice live event. I want to encourage you to please join the newsletter. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram. There's always updates. There's always important information. There's always new information coming in about upcoming projects. Tonight I want to take a little time to talk about, or to ramble on about, dashboards and fuel tanks. It seems to cause a lot of confusion, as simple of a topic as it may be. I have a great interest in it because, to me, one of the most important areas of the motorcycle is the fuel tank and dashboard. It's one of the first things that catches your eye. To me, it's more than fit and fitment. It's more than how much you spent on custom paint. If you look from the side or you look from the back of the bike and it just doesn't quite look correct or flow correctly, to me, it's just not right. I like to have things where they are presentable. When you look at them, they're enjoyable to look at. When it comes to fitment, I want to try and cover, and I'm not going to use the word generation. I want to cover 3 different styles of fuel tanks because I've been in more than one conversation that turned sour about where the start date, stop date, cutoff date was pertaining to a certain style of fuel tank, dashboard, speedometer. And I can assure you, by the end of this conversation I'm going to have with you, there's a lot to it if you're going to start changing components. There are certain components that you could just swap out from one generation or one style to the next. And then there's other components that I will touch on briefly that get very detailed in order to make them operate correctly. When it comes to fuel tanks, I want to try and set a benchmark from the cone style engines. And again, I'm not going to place a generation or a date on it. To date. All right, from the cone style engine to date. The 3 styles of fuel tanks I want to cover are going to be flat sides, which are primarily found, again, don't hold me to it, on your shovel heads prior. You're going to find your fat bob fuel tanks. And now I'm basically discussing split fuel tanks. Whether they be 4.2s, 5.2s, some call them 4, some call them 5 gallon. We all know how much fluid or how much gasoline they hold. If you ride enough and you hit reserve, you know the bike took 3.8 gallons on a 4.2 setup. That's how much fuel I used before I hit reserve. Flat side fuel tanks, primarily used on shovel heads, are the tanks that you'll find have an internal thread that holds the tank to the motorcycle frame. It has a welded tab off the frame. It has a through bolt up front, both top and bottom. The big downfall, or the weak link with the flat side fuel tank, was if they weren't mounted correctly and they were bolted down with the fine thread that went into the boss on the tank, it would either wear quickly or pull the thread, the tank would become useless, or it'd become loose and want to fall off and hit the rocker box. Again, this primarily happened with shovel heads. Those tanks had their place. They are very valuable in great condition nowadays. They're not something you want to use. It's much like the computer. If you have your choice of a new computer or a 20-year-old computer, obviously the one you're going to get the greater benefit from is the newer design. Nothing wrong with the true flat side tank. If you happen to have an old set, and again I'm talking about flat sides back to the beginning of the cone style engine. But if you have something prior to that, whether it be panhead generator style cam cover or even older than that, that happen to have the left side tank with the brackets that would take the old style shifter, they're very, very valuable. Don't sell yourself short if you happen to have a set. You know, make sure you do a little research if you happen to have old things hanging around. They don't have a bunch of reality shows pertaining to finding things in barns because old parts don't have value. Excuse me. Jumping ahead another generation or another style is the Fat Bob fuel tank. Now again, we're talking about split fuel tanks. Tanks that are two-piece. They bolt on the left and right side. Left side typically has the fuel valve. The Fat Bob generation or Fat Bob style of fuel tank had a different style fuel cap. It was a screw-in thread, whereas the true flat side had two tabs that you just gave it a half a spin and it locked down. And the reason I'm even getting into this in such detail is that it's important to know anything can be made to fit. This is one of the most creative hobbies I've ever been introduced to. That's why I love it so deeply. You can certainly put a set of flat side fuel tanks on a newer style Softail. Going to take a lot of work, going to take a lot of creative thought, but it can be done. There's nothing that can't be done, but you need to make yourself aware and set a game plan as to what the cost and what the end product is going to be. Is it what you're expecting? Fat Bob fuel tanks had an entirely different design than the flat side. They had a rubber grommet. There was a welded tab on the frame. You bolted the tanks downward and then picked up a top and bottom bolt. They had much more flexibility to the vibration of whether it was the shovel, and there was some shovel Fat Bob tanks, or the generation of Evolution engines, and then the final in late 90s, the introduction of the twin cam brought on the one-piece tank. One-piece tank is a great design. It gave us the fuel gauge, because you typically couldn't have a fuel gauge with the split tanks, flat side or Fat Bob, because you had to fill each tank and not depend on a small crossover to allow the fuel to flow to the left side tank, which is where the fuel gauge is found on a single style tank. When you're into a one-piece tank, typically found on twin cams and newer, I'm not going to put a date on it. Let's say it started at 99 or 2000. The fuel gauge was on the left side. You were able to fill from the right. Being a one-piece tank, very similar to what you're looking at here. The fuel was able to cross over quickly. You got a good fill in the tank. The gauge worked properly. You didn't have that luxury with Fat Bob tanks. All right. Again, we're talking about the split style tank. That's a tank that's in two-piece. You're seeing a set here of what are probably mid to late 90s bad boy springers. Most all FL models And I'm not talking FLSs, FLSTF, FLSTC, but FLH, FLTs were a one-piece tank from way back. Some of them had fuel gauges up in the dashboards. Again, a lot of those early FLs, and if you've been tinkering with bikes as long as I have, you'll remember what was called the ugly duckling. Everybody removed parts and you were left with a big FL fairing with a full-size dash with a speedo and a fuel gauge. There was an oil light. All kinds of craziness going on. But no matter what you did, you just couldn't make it pretty. And I've seen creative people go as far as putting split style, flat sides or fat bob tanks on an old style FL frame with the dash and the speedo. Fuel tanks, you just have to be careful. Unless you're in a position where you want to start cutting tabs, mocking up tack welding, final welding tabs to the frame of your bike. And remember, once you make a custom move like that, very rarely can you go back. You know, and if you're going to do something like that, the best piece of advice I can give you is make sure you take your time and use someone, if you're not talented enough or not mechanically inclined enough to do it all by yourself, which I hope most of you are. I hope I can help you do things like this. Make sure the help you're getting is talented to the point where when the job's completed, aesthetically it looks correct. I can't tell you how many tabs I've seen welded on just a little bit askew or crooked. And no matter how you view the bike, whether it's stationary or riding, the motorcycle itself has a listing effect. Like a boat that's half sinking, because the tanks really aren't mounted on the frame square and true. You know, any type of modifications, custom you're doing. And that's what it's all about with the Harleys. There's no doubt about it. We love to customize them. This, what you're looking at, is a 2001 Fat Boy. Granted, it's still got the Fat Boy front end on it, but they did a lot of custom work. A lot of the shiny, a lot of things you got to keep good and clean to keep the shiny up to speed. Bear that in mind also. The one-piece fuel tank. There was a few years that they were carbureted. And again, I'm getting fairly deep into this conversation because more often than not, I come across friends and contacts through Fix My Hog that are disappointed at what they purchased isn't what they needed to do the job. Whether it be at a swap meet or it be online, you know, they just thought that if they bought a dashboard or a fuel tank, everything would look cool. Again, direct bolt-on fitment, from year to year, model to model, you've got to be very careful if it's going to be a true bolt-on or plug-and-play fitment. And there's nothing wrong with doing a little customization. You need to move that, you need to move this. Just be aware that what you're moving in a safe location, away from heat if it's susceptible to heat, or that it's going to stay mounted where you put it. One-piece fuel tank is great. Again, I can't get by the fuel gauge. For those of you that don't like to just run to reserve and then hope you got enough on reserve to get to the next gas station, the fuel gauge is invaluable. But along with the one-piece fuel tank came a big square box-style frame, even on the soft tails. The prior to one-piece fuel tank soft tails were a round down tube, this section of the frame, where the newer bikes or a square down tube, a square backbone that one-piece tank cradles over and it's nice and secure. The one-piece tank by far is much more secure than the two-piece tanks, but my preference is and will always be for the Fat Bob style tanks. I just like the fact it's two split tanks, especially the 5 gallons or 5.2s, which are very hard to find, Evolution generation anyway, in good condition original Harley sheet metal. So again, you got these hanging around, know that you've got something of value. When it comes to just the dashboard, I've already loosened this one up. Just the dash itself. You can use the dashboard prior to 95 or 96, which is typically the cutoff for a true mechanical speedometer, as opposed to the newer style. I want to call it electronic, but they're more commonly known as a digital speedometer. In my opinion, the only part that's digital on the newer speedos is the odometer. It still has a needle, which I consider an analog instrument. It's an instrument that's reading your speed. It's got a needle. To me, it's analog. When it comes to the dashboard itself, there are components you can retrofit back. There are components you can retrofit forward. So let's say a 92 will fit a 97, even though one was built mechanical speedo and the 97 would be an electronic speedometer. Big difference in the speedometer is the mechanical setup, hence the name mechanical, is driven by a cable. The cable, always built from the factory, was driven from a drive off the front wheel on the left side. I have seen some on the right, but for the most part they drove off the left side of the front wheel. What it is, it's a rubber housing with a spring steel cable that spins at the same speed of the front wheel, drives the speedometer. It's a true mechanical odometer, and it's a very simple setup. All right, the drive ratio of the mechanical drive on the front wheel must match the diameter of the front wheel. If, for instance, you run a 16-inch front wheel with a 21-inch drive, your speedometer, mile per hours, and odometer, obviously, are going to read incorrectly. You can retrofit any motorcycle to a mechanical setup. The fact is, to space the front wheel correctly, put the correct speedometer drive, make sure there is an index allocation in the front rotor. Typically, that's what spins the speedo drive, is the allocation in the rotor. You need a speedo cable, you can mount a small mechanical speedo anywhere on the motorcycle. Point of this exercise being, why? It's very simple, it's very basic, but what's available? Oh, let me throw this into a quick scenario. Why would you want to try to cook something over a can of Sterno when you can use a microwave? That's how I compare the old mechanical speedos, and please don't misunderstand me. My 95 Springer, still mechanical speedo, I love it. The newer electronics offer a broader variety of options for the rider. And when I say options for the rider, I'm talking about self-canceling turn signals, cruise control, There's check engine lights, there's ABS lights. The electric speedo or digital speedo is what's here to stay. So for guys like me, you got to get used to it, and you got to get used to working on it. So again, you can retrofit a mechanical to anything. But why would you want to? Not so easy to put the new electrical or digital speedometer on an older generation bike. And I say not so easy, I've done it more than once. The key with the electric speedo is that it reads off of a speedometer sensor, much like the ones found in an automobile, a wheel speed sensor, except this one enters the crankcase and reads off of one of the transmission gears for speed miles per hour. And again, if you happen to change anything, whether you go from 5-speed to 6-speed, you need to make sure things get calibrated correctly and the speedometer is reading correctly. I've gotten to more than one conversation about wheel diameter changes with the new electronic speedometers, and that you can do a little research for yourself. More than welcome to throw the questions at me, but I can assure you, a motorcycle that's built with 16-inch wheels from the factory and you put 18s on it, that speedometer will not read correctly. Throw the questions at me. I'm happy to answer them. Back to fitment. The chrome dashboard. You cannot use post-96 on pre-96 models. The speedometer head mounts differently. The dash mounts differently to the fuel tanks. The older style fat bob or flat side fuel tanks have what we call a 3-bolt base plate. That base plate mounts to the backbone of the frame with 3 bolts. It holds the speedometer head, the indicator lights, the circuit breakers, and some of the older models prior to self-canceling turn signals, it would hold a regular automotive style flasher underneath. Now, yes, you can convert them, but you need to be aware that there's a lot of finagling with the wiring harness that must be done, and must be done correctly if you expect a dependable ride. If your bike was dependable with the mechanical setup and you decided to convert to electric, make sure it remains dependable. That's the key with custom things. Just trying to think. Back to converting from mechanical to electrical. Unless you have a transmission that has the allocation in the crankcase for the speedo sensor, you can't put an electric speedo on it. Yes, the aftermarket industry does offer sensors that mount to the swing arm and read off the back wheel. It's always a viable option. If you insist on being creative, always weigh your options, cost per benefit. And when I say benefit, how important is it for you to have an electric or digital speedo as opposed to the mechanical setup that your motorcycle was born or built with? Electric speedometers, the early generations, whenever you removed them from the motorcycle, you can see there's a handful of connectors. This is later generation. You can see all it takes is a few plugs, and I've got the entire speedo head in my hand. Whereas the mechanical setup, all you're doing is pulling that center bolt and taking away just the cover, not the speedometer head, not the ignition switch, circuit breakers or flasher if applicable. They all stayed mounted between the two-piece fat bob or flat side fuel tank. The early digitals, if you have them off your bike, by all means avoid tipping them completely upside down. Problem with that, some of the early LCD odometers, the liquid would seep or weep out of them when they were upside down. When you plugged them back in, all you'd have is a scramble screen for the odometer reading. They are basic. The speedometer as an assembly is held in just with this white nylon plastic. Very easy to change out. Not much to them. The older style dashboards would have two individual strips of gaskets as opposed to this one piece. And they'd also have a fairly big notch here on the front where they would clear a notch or a boss on the down tube, the backbone of the frame. And the reason I'm really getting in depth with this is because more than once I've had a friend of mine come up, my dashboard's all pitted. I bought this dash at the swap meet. I got a great deal. It's brand new. And I had to tell them that won't fit your bike at all. And it's not something you can really return at the swap meet. You know, I'm sure if you purchased online, some have return policies. The key is to buy the correct component, whether it's just changing the dash or doing a conversion. Buy the correct component the first time. Big identifier between electric speedometer and mechanical speedometer. The odometer knob, hole in itself in the dashboard, is on the left side electric. It's on the right side on a mechanical speedometer. And I've seen it more than once. People with mechanical setups in the new style dash just don't use the odometer knob. I've seen people drill them. I've seen a lot of creative things. I've seen people drill them and walk right across the chrome. And there's a big scar, but you know what? They made it work. I'm all for it. Another big difference, probably one of the bigger differences, is ignition switch. Once they went to electronic speedometers, the ignition switch itself changed drastically. It went from a 2-click forward folding protective latch to a 1-click side folding switch. Now you can convert forward folding to side folding either direction. You've got to be real tricky because the forward folding, the older style, 2-click switches, had a number of wires going to them with small screws, where the new style is just a 3-prong connector, goes right from the motorcycle's main harness right to the ignition switch. So you've got to be aware, if you're going to do this conversion, you've got to eliminate where those, I can't remember exactly, 6 or 8 wires, let's call them, where those will join together to make 3 to use the new style switch. You can use a new style switch on an old style 3-bolt base plate. It just needs to be spaced correctly. And I've done piles of these conversions because, in all honesty, the old style 2-click forward flip switch is very vulnerable to the environment, condensation, and vibration. All right. Another big factor between old style mechanical dashes and new style dashes is that the indicator lights themselves on the old style dash are actually part of the base plate. They're sockets with bulbs that you'll see. And again, I can show you all of this. The only way to really know what you're looking at is to take it apart correctly. Take some photos, lay your trail of breadcrumbs, and don't be afraid to put a wrench on your motorcycle. That's really the key of Fix My Hog and Bob's ranting and raving about let's work on our own bikes. The integrated indicator lights, you'll notice, use a different style lens, and they are all self-contained wire-wise. It's typically plug and play. The older style, pre-95 or thereabouts, everything is individual wired under to that 3-bolt base plate. And I don't want to be redundant. I don't want to make this confusing. But again, if you're going to buy a new dash and you buy yourself the wrong dash, I can assure you none of these components are going to swap directly over. And unless you're ready for a big customization, you need to buy the right component. That's the long and the short of it. This style dash will fit everything all the way back. The key is to make sure that you're wire savvy enough to convert what is in your existing harness to the new harness. I do prefer the new style single ignition switch. Even on big inch motors, high compression setups, I have a tendency to run a separate toggle switch to shut off all the lights. That way there, when I turn that one click, all I've got is spark and ignition. That's a whole nother topic. What I don't care for is the small indicator light setup on the newer style. I myself thought the older pre-95 with the big lens, and if you've owned one, that'd be the lens you tighten down a 1/2-inch acorn and it'd crack the lens if you tighten it too tight. Those you could really see, visibly see. Although these bulbs may be brighter, my personal opinion is the indicator allotment is too small to really view in direct sun, or if you've got a lot of chrome, it makes it more difficult to see. I have done conversions. Now, this is a real touchy subject with a lot of people. As long as your Softail, I'm going to stay with Softails, has an integrated starter motor. When I say that, I'm not talking about external solenoid on the inner primary. As long as you've got a new one-piece starter motor, you can directly swap out your 5-speed for a newer style 5-speed with the hole punched into the case. And the hole you're looking for is typically found right near the transmission clutch cover. That's the sensor. But if you don't have that allotment, you can't use an electric speedo. Unless, of course, you go deep into the aftermarket, which is perfectly fine. The problem with that becomes the word deep, cost, and effort. If you can find yourself a newer style 5-speed and swap it over directly into an older style mechanically driven bike, and I'm going to use 89 to 95 as you can just swap the 5-speed trick. Prior to 89, you had the external solenoid on the inner primary. Besides the external solenoid, what that brought you was a tapered main shaft off the transmission with a keyway. You can't just use the newer style splined main shaft transmission, clutch hub, primary chain, compensating sprocket, all of that goes hand in hand with the break point from keyed main shaft to splined main shaft. All right, I know I'm throwing just a lot out there. Again, the point of this whole event is if you plan on changing tanks, speedos, transmissions, make sure you think it out. Make sure it's well thought out, that you're not missing one vital component when you're reassembling. Or you finally put everything together and say, boy, I wish I had done that because it was a viable option with this conversion. All electronics have their place. Obviously, you need newer technology with the newer motorcycles. You're not going to take a 2015, 2017, a 2013 motorcycle and put a mechanical speedo on it. But if you're building a custom bike, and believe me, there is custom mechanical setups that drive off the rear wheel that are super trick. You know, it all depends what you own, what you ride, what you plan on customizing. Use your head. Don't rush into purchasing things. That's probably the best piece of advice I can give you. 7 out of 10 times when people are rushed or pressured into doing what their buddy did, or it seems like a great deal, I better buy it now, it leads to certain failure. Take your time, weigh out all your options, including resale value. By customizing or molesting, I've heard more than one of my friends say, the motorcycle, how is it going to affect resale value? And we all love our bikes. We all plan on keeping them forever. But if the time arises, like a beautiful woman, something catches your eye, you may want to make a lateral move. Don't sell yourself short because you customize something to your preference, but you killed the resale value. I get a pile of questions. I get into a pile of conversations. I get into a pile of confrontations about check engine lights. My electric speedo's terrible. I hate the fact I have to go to the dealer to have it scanned for it to tell me what's wrong. My turn signals won't shut off. My alarm system won't turn on. My full-wave flashers come on at will. The dealer wants to charge me this much because they own the scan tool. There are aftermarket options for scan tools. It doesn't make them much cheaper. But if you happen to have a friend or someone in the business that has one, they will perform the same procedure, same process as the dealer's scan tool without going to the dealer. Me, myself, I've always been a faithful follower. If you bought a motorcycle that is under warranty, you enjoyed the time frame of the warranty, you have a good rapport with your dealer, just because you're out of warranty doesn't mean you stop going to them. Obviously, for some unknown reason, dealers seem to be more expensive than the private mom and pop shops. Then again, I know mom and pop shops which make dealers look like they're doing the job for free. But then again, those particular mom and pop shops are doing things that are off the charts. They're doing customization that is second to none. So again, if you need the bike scanned, you don't necessarily want to bring it to a full-blown custom builder, unless again he's a friend of yours. The dealer, you may have to pay the piper, have him scan and figure out what the issue at hand is, and then I encourage you to take that information and do the final repair yourself. Very rarely is there a stored code in a speedometer that has to be cleared once the problem is resolved. It may hold it historically, but it won't throw it as a reoccurring code once you address the problem at hand. I'm going to take a couple moments, just think a little bit of if there's anything else I want to throw out on the table. I want to make sure that we're all aware of the Fix My Hog newsletter. I greatly encourage you to join us, Fix My Hog, on Facebook, on Instagram. The newsletter is invaluable. I'm going to take a few moments. I just want to gather my thoughts. I'm going to do a little Q&A, which it's preempted, but I added a little bit of spice to the questions that are at hand. And I also have questions that rise commonly amongst my friends, amongst motorcycles I work on, whether it be mechanical or electric. One of the most common ones I come across is my mechanical speedometer stopped working. And like most mechanical repairs, you've got to take a step back. What was touched, if anything, what was touched last? Did the mechanical drive speedometer just stop working while you were riding? Or did you just have a front wheel or front tire? Or the wheel was off the bike? Did you have something done in the front end where the drive engages into the wheel? Most commonly, that little tab on the mechanical speedometer drive isn't put back into the proper position. The axle's torqued and the tab bends back, spins around, causes an awful score mark, especially on a chrome or polished rotor, and then stops working. Don't blame anyone in particular, especially if you did it yourself. Never blame yourself for a learning experience. If you happen to tighten that axle down and you broke the tab or you bent the tab on the mechanical drive speedo, loosen it back up, replace the drive if need be, bend the tab back into position, move forward, chalk it up as a learning experience.
All right, somebody has a question on...
Oh, actually, I'm going to get some input.
Right,
please.
Somebody has a question on speedometer. They had a 5-speed in their Softail, and then they put a 6-speed in.
Okay.
And then the speed is off. It says they're doing 40, but they're really doing 50 on the speedometer.
All right, any time you break away from the stock configuration, whether it's a factory-built 5-speed or 6-speed, if you've got a 6-speed, obviously you're not putting a 6-speed in it. You shouldn't have a speedometer calibration issue. If you go from 5-speed to 6-speed, that stock speedo sensor will not read correctly because the ratio internally has changed. They do make plug-and-play calibration boxes, which you can either ride along someone you trust and check your speed at 30, 40, 50 and set it manually, or you can get on a dynamometer and set it to the exact speed while the back wheel is reading through the gear ratio. it's not uncommon to see the newer style electrics or the older style mechanicals read incorrectly. I myself, especially when I'm riding with others, like to watch my speed, because if others seem to be riding too quick for me, first thing I think, especially if they're on a custom bike, is their speedometers are inaccurate. And I'm not going to ride faster just to keep up with the pack. I'm always going to ride at a safe speed. It's a hobby. It's not the point I need to get from A to B. That to me is more important, to get from A to B safely, as opposed to looking cool or my speed being correct. When it comes to digital or electric speedometers not working correctly, now I'm not talking about 5 and 6 speed conversions. I'm just talking about one day I was riding and my odometer stopped working. My speedometer needle is bouncing. First place I head to is the speedometer sensor, the one that goes into the transmission case. The reason for that, being a constant mesh transmission, gear to gear contact, there is debris. And I've seen, it's a magnetic Hall effect style sensor, the speedo sensor. I've seen that magnet collect chips, and what it does, it affects the signal going to the speedometer head. Take that sensor out carefully, clean everything, make sure the O-ring's intact, take any debris off of the sight glass or window, put it back in, try that first. Always start with basics. Don't just go out and buy a new sensor. Don't go out and buy a new speedometer. Always start with basics. Not that I'm cheap. I like to work from the small side, or if you insist, the cheap side of a repair, to the expensive or the large side.
All right, somebody else has a question. He has a 96 Heritage. His indicator turn signal lights stay on when instead of blinking. He said that he turned the turn button for the signal, but they just come on and stay on. And that's Johnny Gardner from Australia.
Well, thank you, sir. Nice to know we've got friends down under. At this point, I think I've got friends worldwide. When it comes to turn signals, especially the newer motorcycles with self-canceling turn signals, with turn signal modules, TSMs, turn signal security modules, TSSMs, and beyond, when it comes to full electronics, the biggest issue I see is grounds. I see ground wires, whether it be a corroded socket where the bulb is. I see ground wires, whether it be corrosion where the connection is made contact to the frame, the earthing point being the biggest culprit. I also see conversions wreaking havoc with electronic systems. The old style automotive flasher worked great with an 1157, 1156 bulb. But if you threw anything type LED or any type of different voltage draw at it, it worked inadequately. Same applies with new style electronics. If you happen to change out your factory turn signal for a custom turn signal, make yourself aware you may need to get some type of equalizer box so that TSM, TSSM reads the voltage correctly and operates correctly. Again, always start with the simple, then head to the hard.
All right, so somebody else says they have a 1995 FXDWG, and his speedometer cable is making noise.
Dyna Wide Glide FXDWG, as opposed to FXSTC They really look alike. One's rubber mounted, the Dyna obviously, the other one's Softail. In that generation or that era, they were all mechanically driven speedos. If it's making noise, it's one of two things, the cable or the drive. The easy fix, depending on your environment, your mileage, the condition of the bike, is to replace the speedometer cable. And it's a fairly simple operation. You know, you basically pull your dash away. At that point, the 3-bolt base plate mechanical speedo dash stays with the fat bob tank. You remove the 2 C-clips on the speedo head. Carefully lift the speedo head away. You loosen the nut on the bottom of the cable. Take the speedo, set it aside in a safe place. At that point, you can turn your cable out of the drive on the front wheel. Get yourself some good quality lubricant into the drive. A lot of times what I do, I put the motorcycle on a lift, get the weight off the front wheel, spin the drive. Make sure I'm not getting any noise, any grinding, any resistance. That the tab is located correctly in the rotor, and get a nice coat of good quality lubricant in the speedo drive on the axle next to the wheel engaging in the rotor. At that point, if I'm going to take a speedo cable off, I'm going to replace it. Cheap enough item. And when you do go to replace it, quick, easy tip, hold that lock nut that goes to the base of the mechanical speedometer, hold it all the way to the top of the cable, put a tie wrap on it, cut the tail off the tie wrap, and then feed it downward through the backbone. You'll see there's a round allocation in the frame. Feed it through, thread it into the drive. Now you don't need to worry about that nut, the jam nut that goes to the mechanical speedo, falling down through the frame, running along the cable. The tie wrap will hold it in place. Tighten it back down. Before you install it on the speedo, give it a good coat of lubricant. All it is a spring steel style cable in a rubber housing. Faster you go, faster it spins. Warmer it gets. Keep it lubed, keep it maintained. Mechanical speedos run indefinitely. Electric speedos, probably, the truth be told, will run longer. The key is maintenance. We all know that it's becoming harder and harder to stress. Maintenance is your responsibility. There's a lot of areas I covered. As always, I hope you walk away from this dissertation, this presentation, this event with the wheels turning. I don't want them turning fast enough where you create smoke, but I do want you to walk away and say, wow, Bob gave me a bunch of food for thought. I was planning on doing this and that, but I don't think I'm either mechanically prepared or financially ready to do that. Or, you know what? I'm glad he brought to my attention, I can't put an electric speedo on my 94 because I don't have the hole in the tranny case. And I might have a buddy who's got a transmission, but before I go buy a dash, ignition switch, speedometer head, do a bunch of wiring changes. No, I want to make a quick note. If you plan on converting from 3-bolt base plate to the self-contained dash of the new electric speedo, you've got to put all those circuit breakers and flasher, if applicable, that are underneath the base plate somewhere. The newer bikes, 96, late 95, 96, had a cutout in the back fender under the seat with a little black plastic box with circuit breakers and the starter relay. The turn signal module itself, self-canceling module, wound up underneath the tank itself on the split style tanks. You know, do some research. If you get a chance to see a friend's bike apart that happens to be the newer generation or the newer style, get a good look at it before you go and jump in without looking first. I'm Bob LaRosa for Fix My Hog. I'm so glad that you're back for another event. I can't encourage you enough to please join us. Join the newsletter. Watch us on Facebook. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram. Keep up to speed. Keep your hands on your bike. I'm not discouraging you that don't want to work on your bike from working on it. I'm not encouraging, you gotta do your own wrenching. You don't have to. But if you want to, do it correctly. And even if you don't want to, it's great knowledge to know how things work, how things function. That's the whole point of Fix My Hog. Fix My Hog is based on the knowledge of working on your own bike. And I want to thank you for joining me. I hope to see you all again.